Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is my pleasure.
I've got to state the question. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr Megan Woods, starting again.
Mr Speaker, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to take a call on this third reading of the Environmental Reporting Bill. What is not my pleasure is the fact that Labor cannot support this bill, because actually I agreed with a great deal that the Minister who just sat down said in his contribution, and that this is an important bill. That New Zealand is one of the only, I think the only country in the OECD that does not have environmental reporting. Labor absolutely agrees that it is timely and it is preferable that this be rectified and that we have a way in which we monitor and report on our environment so that we can be making the important legislative and policy decisions that we need to make in the future based on evidence. And it is this that the Environmental Bill, Reporting Bill, it is our hope that this would deliver. We have consistently been saying throughout the passage of this bill through this House, Mr Speaker, that we have very much wanted to support this bill. We certainly support the intent of it. I think it's pretty much motherhood and apple pie, that we would be monitoring and reporting on our environment and providing that evidence base, that we would be looking at the key 5 domains of air, freshwater, land, marine, atmosphere and climate, producing the domain reports, and then every 3 years having a synthesis report that would cross all domains and draw together the best available data. But Mr Speaker, the Minister says we are churlish in just entering into opposition for the sake of opposition in our opposition to this bill. Nothing could be further from the truth. We worked constructively at Select Committee, and I would like to acknowledge the work the Select Committee did on this legislation. We did actually manage to make some improvements to the legislation, and I think that was a good thing. But what we could not change is what has, since the first reading, since the introduction of this legislation, has been our core concern, and that is the lack of political independence in deciding what it is that we're going to report on, and setting those domain report topics and setting those synthesis report topics, that is vested in the Minister. Now, we haven't objected to this whether we were in government or opposition, Mr Speaker. This is a concern that this is not the kind of legislation with something so important that we put in place that we should be getting wrong. And it is our concern that we are getting it wrong. The Minister tells us, and in his contribution today, he tells us that there is that independence in Clause 18 and guaranteed by Clause 16. This is not the case, Mr Speaker. We listened very carefully to the submitters as they came before the Select Committee. More than half the submitters who came to the committee and spoke to this bill spoke about their concerns around the regulation powers in Clause 18 of this legislation. And that is our reason for not being able to support this bill. We had the Law Society come and tell us that for them, the regulation making power enables ministers to set the agenda by determining the topics to be reported on. The regulation making power has the ability to undermine the independence and integrity of environmental reports published under this bill. This is not something that I could not listen to. This is not something that Labor members on the Select Committee could not take note of. When we have the Law Society come and talk to us about that. We had many submitters, and I'm sure some of my colleagues will go into some more of those. Fish and Game came and gave an excellent submission around this, and I think made a very good point when they said that the grant of some legislative power to the executive is inevitable in modern democracies. But that does not mean that matters of high policy going to the heart of the bill, i.e. setting the topics, should be contained in regulation. This is simply giving the ministers far too much power. We supported the calls that we did have the Chief Statistician and the Secretary for the Environment rather than the Minister for Statistics and the Minister for the Environment making those calls on it, because we did want to see that level of independence. The Minister says that the ministers need to be able to make those things because things change, that we just need to look about how quickly in this space we might need to look at what needs to be reported on, and gave the example of CFCs as something that the environment changes quickly on. We are not for one moment, Mr Speaker, in our opposition, and I want this to be very clear in the record, suggesting in any way that we set down in the legislation what needs to be reported on. What we are saying is that we do not hand over that much power to the executive to set the rules. The people making the decisions. This should be legislation that holds our executive to account. This should be legislation that provides us with the factual basis on which us to measure how a government is performing on the environment. To suggest that it is preferable that we then have the executive making the decision what we report on is nonsense and is not the political independence that we want to see. We do not want to set down in this legislation that we set the topics. That is not what we're suggesting in Clause 18. What we are suggesting is that we take that power away from the ministers, that we give that to the Chief Statistician and to the Secretary for the Environment, who would also be required to consult with some of the groups that are laid out further in Section 18. So, Mr Speaker, I think the Minister's reassurances that one of the reasons that we couldn't do that is because of our need to be flexible and to move with the times simply don't hold water as a reason why we wouldn't do what it is that the Select Committee heard, and that is take this much power away from the executive. We also heard from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, and of course the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has a very important role in this piece of legislation, and that's laid out in Clause 17 of the legislation, and that is in terms of analysing the reports and a commentary function. As Parliament's person who is a bit of a watchdog for the environment, does have an important function under this legislation, and the Parliamentary Commissioner from the Environment gave a very full, a very knowledgeable, and I think a submission that needed to be listened to far more closely by government members of the committee than it was. I would have liked personally to have seen more of the things that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, someone who is Parliament's servant in matters of the environment, came to us as legislators and gave her view that we would have taken more heed. She said that giving the selection of topics to the government of the day creates the opportunity for political interference. For instance, it would be possible to avoid reporting on an environmental topic that is important but also controversial. And that is the point. No one is suggesting for a moment that any given minister is going to politically interfere. But Labor cannot support a piece of legislation that enshrines in our legislation the opportunity for a minister to do that. We need to be better than that in terms of the legislation that we're putting into place. We need to ensure that we cannot do that we are putting in place. New Zealand has waited a long time for this legislation, and I commend the Minister for bringing this legislation, and actually I commend the government for bringing this legislation. But what I cannot commend and support them on, the fact that they're putting it in place without proper political independence. It is a missed opportunity. We could have done so much better, and it is with a heavy heart that Labor cannot vote on this legislation. I remain hopeful that we may be able to work to a more non-partisan position on this, because I think it is important that the very structure that we are putting in place to be the monitoring legislation for our environment not be about partisan politics, that we can actually have some political independence and it genuinely be about the state of our environment, Mr Speaker.